The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Beverly Hills mansion, but Richard Blackwood barely noticed. He sat in his leather chair staring at his phone screen filled with stock prices and business emails. At 52, he had everything money could buy, yet the house felt colder than ever since his wife passed away 2 years ago. Richard had built his fortune from nothing. Starting with a small tech company in his garage, he had clawed his way to the top through deals that others called ruthless, but he called necessary. Now his company was worth hundreds of millions, and his mansion sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured land, but success had a price, and Richard had paid it with relationships that withered and a heart that grew harder with each passing year. The sound of quiet footsteps on the marble brought him back to the present. Maria Santos moved through the room like a ghost, dusting the expensive furniture with careful precision. She had been working for him for 6 months now, and Richard knew almost nothing about her except that she was punctual, thorough, and never complained. Maria was 34. Though the years of hard work had left their mark on her hands and around her eyes, she had come to America 8 years ago with dreams that had quickly been replaced by the reality of survival. Every morning at 5, she would catch the first bus from her small apartment in East Los Angeles to this world of marble and gold, carrying with her the weight of responsibility for her teenage daughter back in Guatemala. She moved quietly through Richard's home, invisible to him most days. He would grunt a greeting if he saw her, sometimes make a comment about missed spots or tasks that needed attention, but mostly he treated her like part of the furniture. Maria preferred it that way. She had learned that wealthy employers were easier to work for when they ignored you. This particular morning, Richard was preparing for one of his monthly dinner parties. These gatherings were business disguised as social events, where Richard would invite potential investors, business partners, and anyone else who might be useful to his empire. The house would be transformed into a stage for his wealth and power, every detail carefully arranged to impress and intimidate. Maria had worked several of these parties before. She would spend the day preparing, polishing every surface until it gleamed, arranging flowers, and making sure the expensive wines were properly chilled. During the event, she would serve drinks and food while the guests talked about money and deals she could never imagine being part of. As she dusted the grand piano in the living room, Maria's fingers lingered for just a moment on the keys. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that had cost Richard more than most people made in 5 years. But like everything else in the house, it was more about showing off than being used. In all her months working there, she had never seen anyone play it. Richard noticed her pause at the piano from across the room. "Careful with that," he called out, not looking up from his phone. "It's worth more than you'll make in a lifetime." Maria nodded silently and continued her work. She was used to comments like that. Richard seemed to take pleasure in reminding the staff of the gap between his world and theirs. It wasn't enough for him to be wealthy. He needed everyone around him to feel small. The morning passed quickly as Maria worked through her checklist. She cleaned the guest bathrooms, polished the dining room table, and arranged fresh flowers in the main hallway. The caterers would arrive in the afternoon to handle the food, but Richard expected the house to be perfect before they even stepped foot inside. Around noon, Richard's assistant called to confirm the guest list for that evening. 8 people would be attending, including a group of investors from New York who were considering putting money into Richard's latest venture. These weren't just any investors. They had the kind of money that could take his company to the next level, and Richard was determined to make the right impression. "Make sure everything is perfect tonight," Richard told Maria as she polished the wine glasses. "These people are important, and I won't tolerate any mistakes." Maria nodded as she always did. She had heard variations of this speech before every party. Richard would pace around the house, pointing out things that needed attention, working himself up into a state of nervous energy that he tried to hide behind commands and criticism. As the afternoon wore on, the house filled with activity. Florists delivered elaborate arrangements. The catering team arrived with trays of expensive appetizers, and Richard changed clothes 3 times before settling on a suit that cost more than Maria's monthly salary. Maria watched it all from the background, doing her part to make sure everything ran smoothly. She knew her role in these events was to be invisible until needed, then disappear again once her task was complete. She had become an expert at moving through rooms full of wealthy people without being noticed, like a shadow that cleaned glasses and removed empty plates. But tonight would be different. Though neither Richard nor Maria knew it yet. Richard had invited these particular guests not just for their money, but because he wanted to prove something to them. They came from old money families, the kind of people who had inherited their wealth rather than fighting for it. They had connections, culture, and a way of speaking that made Richard feel like the outsider he had once been. To compensate, Richard had filled his house with the most expensive things money could buy. The piano was just one example. He had purchased it not because he appreciated music, but because he had read in a magazine that it was the kind of thing sophisticated people owned. It sat in his living room like a beautiful, silent monument to wealth without purpose. Maria knew nothing about Richard's insecurities or his need to impress. She saw only what was in front of her, a man who had everything but seemed to enjoy nothing, who lived in a beautiful house but treated it like a museum. She had worked for other wealthy families, and while some were kind and others were demanding, Richard was different. There was a coldness in him that went beyond mere indifference. As evening approached and the guests began to arrive, Maria retreated to the kitchen to help the caterers. Through the service door, she could hear the sound of conversation and laughter from the dining room. Richard was in his element now, playing the host, telling stories about his business successes and making deals over dinner. None of them could have predicted what would happen when the evening took an unexpected turn, or how a simple cruel gesture would reveal truths that would change everything. The dining room glowed with warm light from the crystal chandelier as 8 guests sat around Richard's polished mahogany table. The evening had started perfectly, just as Richard had planned. The investors from New York seemed impressed with the house. The wine was flowing freely, and the conversation had moved from small talk to serious business discussions. Richard felt confident as he watched his guests enjoy the expensive meal. These weren't just any business people. They were the kind of investors who could write checks that would change everything for his company. The woman at the head of the table, Margaret Chen, controlled a fund worth over $2 billion. The man to her left, David Torres, had made his fortune in real estate, but was now looking to diversify into technology. As Maria moved quietly around the table, refilling wine glasses and removing empty plates, Richard barely noticed her. She had become part of the background, just another expensive item in his perfectly arranged evening. The caterers had done their job well, but it was Maria who made sure every detail was perfect, every glass was clean, every surface was spotless. The conversation at dinner had gone exactly as Richard hoped. He had told stories about his company's growth, shared his vision for the future, and dropped hints about the profits his investors could expect. By dessert, he could see the interest in their eyes. They were ready to do business. But as the evening progressed, Richard noticed something that bothered him. These people had old money, generations of wealth behind them. They spoke with confidence that came from never having to prove themselves. Margaret Chen mentioned her daughter's violin lessons at Juilliard. David Torres talked about the opera season. They had culture, education, and connections that Richard could never buy. It was during dessert that everything changed. Margaret Chen stood up and walked toward the living room, drawn by something she had seen through the open doorway. "Richard, is that a Steinway?" she called out, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Richard's chest swelled with pride as he joined her by the piano. "It is indeed. Model D concert grand. I had it shipped directly from their factory in Hamburg." The other guests gathered around and Richard basked in their impressed murmurs. This was exactly the reaction he wanted. The piano had cost him $200,000, but it was worth every penny for moments like this. "Do you play?" asked David Torres, running his hand along the piano's polished surface. Richard felt a familiar knot in his stomach. "I'm learning," he lied smoothly. The truth was, he had never touched the keys except to dust them. He had bought the piano because his interior designer said it would make the room look sophisticated. "It's such a shame when beautiful instruments like this sit silent," Margaret Chen said softly. "Music is meant to be shared, don't you think?" The comment stung more than Richard expected. He felt exposed like these people could. I'd see right through him. They probably had pianos in their own homes that were actually played, where children practiced scales and families gathered to sing. His piano was beautiful but empty, just like everything else in his life. That's when he noticed Maria collecting dessert plates near the piano. She had paused for just a moment, her cloth in one hand as she looked at the instrument, It was barely noticeable, but Richard caught it. The way her eyes lingered on the keys, the slight tilt of her head as if she was listening to music that only she could hear. An idea formed in Richard's mind, cruel and sharp. Here was his chance to regain control of the situation, to remind everyone of the natural order of things. He was the successful businessman, the one with power and money. She was just the help. Actually, Richard said loudly, drawing everyone's attention back to him, we might be able to hear some music tonight after all. Maria continued clearing plates, unaware that she had become the center of attention. Richard's voice cut through the quiet murmur of conversation. Maria, he called out, using the tone he reserved for giving orders. Come here for a moment. She looked up, surprised to be addressed directly in front of guests. Setting down her tray, she walked over with the careful steps of someone who knew their place in the world. My guests were just admiring the piano, Richard said, his voice taking on a mocking edge that made some of the guests shift uncomfortably. And I couldn't help but notice how you always seem so fascinated by it when you're cleaning. Maria stood quietly, sensing danger but not sure where it was coming from. The guests watched with growing unease as Richard's smile became predatory. I'm sure someone with your background must know some music, Richard continued, drawing out the words. Maybe some folk songs from your homeland? I bet our guests would love to hear something authentic. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret Chen looked away, clearly uncomfortable. David Torres frowned and took a sip of his wine. The other guests stared at their hands or found sudden interest in the artwork on the walls. But Richard wasn't finished. The power he felt in that moment was intoxicating. Here he was, showing these cultured people that he understood the real world, the way things worked. They might have their fancy educations and old money, but he knew how to exercise control. Come on, don't be shy, he pressed, gesturing toward the piano bench. I'm sure you've always wondered what it would be like to play such an expensive instrument. Here's your chance. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she held her cleaning cloth. She understood now what was happening. This wasn't kindness or curiosity. This was humiliation disguised as generosity. Richard wanted her to fail in front of these important people, to remind everyone of their proper places. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Some guests looked angry at Richard's behavior, while others simply looked embarrassed to witness it. Margaret Chen started to speak, probably to change the subject, but Richard held up his hand. I insist, he said, his voice now carrying an edge of command. After all, I pay for this piano. Surely my staff should be able to provide a little entertainment for my guests. Maria looked at the piano, then at the faces around her. She saw pity in some eyes, anger in others, and cruel satisfaction in Richard's. She was trapped between refusing and seeming ungrateful, or trying to play and likely embarrassing herself in front of these wealthy strangers. Her throat felt dry as she realized there was no way out of this situation that wouldn't end in humiliation. Richard had cornered her perfectly, using his power and position to force her into an impossible choice. The beautiful instrument that she had admired from afar was now a weapon pointed at her dignity. The seconds ticked by as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Maria's heart pounded as she made a decision that would change everything. Maria stood frozen in the middle of Richard's living room, feeling the weight of 8 pairs of eyes watching her. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, while Richard waited with that cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won, thought he had put her in her place in front of his important guests. For a moment, Maria considered walking away. She could excuse herself, return to the kitchen, and let Richard explain to his guests why his maid had refused to entertain them. But something inside her stirred, something that had been sleeping for 8 long years. She looked at the piano again, really looked at it this time. The polished black surface reflected the chandelier light like still water. The keys seemed to call to her, white and black in perfect order, waiting. Her fingers tingled with a memory so strong it almost hurt. Without saying a word, Maria walked slowly toward the piano bench. The guests watched in uncomfortable silence, some looking away because they couldn't bear to witness what they thought would be her humiliation. Richard's smile grew wider. He was already imagining how he would laugh about this later, how he would tell the story of the maid who thought she could play piano. Maria set her cleaning cloth on a side table and sat down at the bench. For a moment she simply sat there, her hands resting in her lap. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear the soft whisper of her breathing. Then something magical happened. Maria's posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. Her back became perfectly aligned and her head lifted with a dignity that transformed her completely. The tired cleaning woman disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. Her hands rose to the keyboard, hovering just above the keys like a bird about to take flight. The first notes that came from the piano were soft, almost whispered. Maria's fingers found the keys with the certainty of someone coming home after a long journey. She began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces ever written for piano. The melody started gently, like a story being told by candlelight. Each note was perfect, placed exactly where it belonged in the musical conversation. Maria's hands moved with fluid grace, her left hand providing a steady foundation while her right hand sang the melody with heartbreaking beauty. Richard's smile faded as the first phrase filled the room. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't some fumbling attempt at a folk song or a nervous amateur struggling with simple chords. This was something else entirely. As the piece developed, Maria's playing grew more confident, more powerful. The gentle opening gave way to more complex passages that required years of training to master. Her fingers danced across the keys with impossible speed and precision, making the difficult look effortless. Margaret Chen had stopped breathing. As someone who had studied music herself and supported classical musicians for decades, she recognized not just skill, but artistry of the highest level. This wasn't just someone who could play piano. This was a real musician, someone with deep understanding of the music's meaning and emotion. The other guests found themselves drawn into the spell of the music. David Torres, who had been checking his phone throughout dinner, now sat transfixed. The couple from Boston, who had been whispering about their flight home, were completely silent. Even the catering staff had stopped their work in the kitchen to listen, but it was Richard who was most shocked. He stood behind the piano, watching Maria's hands move across the keys he had never learned to play, hearing music pour from the instrument he had bought only for show. The woman he had tried to humiliate was revealing herself to be more accomplished than anyone in the room, including himself. As the piece continued, Maria seemed to disappear into the music completely. Her eyes were closed now, her whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm. This wasn't performance anymore. This was communion. She was speaking a language she had been forced to forget, telling a story she had kept locked inside her heart for 8 years. The music built to its first climax, Maria's left hand providing thunderous bass notes while her right hand soared above in passionate melody. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, every note singing with perfect clarity and expression. The sound filled not just the room but seemed to fill the very air itself. Tears began to roll down Maria's cheeks, but she didn't stop playing. If anything, her playing became more intense, more emotional. This was her story being told through Chopin's notes. The dreams she had abandoned, the life she had left behind, the music that had never really left her heart. The guests were completely captivated. Margaret Chen had tears in her eyes too, recognizing the profound skill and emotion she was witnessing. This was the kind of performance that happened maybe once in a lifetime, when technique and soul came together in perfect harmony. Richard felt something strange happening in his chest. The cruel satisfaction he had felt moments before was gone, replaced by something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Deep, burning shame at what he had tried to do, and awe at what was actually happening. The music reached its emotional peak, Maria's hands flying across the keyboard in passages that would challenge even professional concert pianists. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with the understanding that comes from years of dedicated study and natural talent. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Maria opened her eyes. For the first time since she had started playing, she looked at her audience. But she wasn't seeing the wealthy dinner guests or the expensive room anymore. She was seeing concert halls in Guatemala City, music teachers who had believed in her, audiences who had applauded her performances before her world had changed forever. The final notes of the piece rang out in the silent room, hanging in the air like the last drops of rain after a storm. Maria's hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if she couldn't bear to break the connection between herself and the music. Then she stood up from the bench, smoothed her uniform and picked up her cleaning cloth. The spell was broken, but its effects lingered in every face in the room. She had shared 15 minutes of pure artistry with people who thought they knew her, and had revealed a truth that none of them could ignore. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet of before. This was the silence of people who had witnessed something extraordinary and were struggling to process what they had experienced. Maria walked quietly toward the kitchen, ready to continue her work as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Richard stood by his expensive piano, finally understanding what it was truly capable of in the right hands, and realizing how wrong he had been about so many things. The silence that followed Maria's performance seemed to stretch forever. She had returned to the kitchen, but her music still echoed in the minds of everyone who had heard it. The guests remained in the living room, looking at each other with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Richard stood by the piano, his hand resting on the same keys that Maria had just played with such incredible skill. He felt lost, like a man who had thought he knew his way home only to discover he had been walking in the wrong direction all along. Margaret Chen was the first to break the silence. "Richard," she said softly, "where on earth did you find her?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. Richard realized he had no answer. In 6 months of employing Maria, he had never asked about her background, her education, or her life before she started working for him. He knew she was from Guatemala, that she was reliable, and that she cleaned his house well. Beyond that, she had been invisible to him. She came through an agency," Richard stammered, feeling foolish for the first time in years. "An agency?" David Torres shook his head in amazement. "Richard, do you have any idea what we just witnessed? That was concert-level playing. That piece she played, it's one of the most difficult in the classical repertoire." The other guests began to murmur among themselves, their voices filled with awe and confusion. How could someone with such extraordinary talent be working as a maid? What kind of story lay behind those skilled hands and that beautiful performance? Margaret Chen excused herself from the group and walked toward the kitchen. She found Maria there, back to washing dishes as if nothing remarkable had happened. Maria looked up when Margaret entered, expecting to be told she had overstepped her bounds. "That was extraordinary," Margaret said gently, switching to Spanish as she recognized something in Maria's eyes. The simple kindness in Margaret's voice, combined with hearing her native language, broke something loose in Maria's chest. Tears that she had held back for years began to flow freely. In halting Spanish, Margaret asked about Maria's musical background, and slowly, like water breaking through a dam, Maria's story began to pour out. She had grown up in Guatemala City, where her mother cleaned offices to pay for her daughter's piano lessons. Maria showed talent early, and by age 10 she was studying with the best teachers in the country. She earned a full scholarship to the National Conservatory of Music, where she graduated at the top of her class. For several years, Maria had been Guatemala's rising star pianist. She performed with the National Symphony, gave solo recitals in the capital's best concert halls, and was preparing to apply for advanced study in Europe. Music wasn't just her career, it was her whole identity, her reason for being. But then the violence got worse. Political unrest turned deadly, and musicians, intellectuals, and artists became targets. Maria's cousin, a journalist, was killed. Her music teacher disappeared one night and was never seen again. When threats began appearing at her own concerts, Maria's family made the heartbreaking decision to flee. They left everything behind. Her piano, her music library, her carefully built career, her dreams. In America, Maria discovered that her conservatory degree meant nothing. Without American credentials, she couldn't teach at music schools or perform in concert halls. She spoke limited English and had no connections in the music world. Survival became more important than art. Maria took whatever work she could find, sending most of her earnings home to support her teenage daughter who had stayed with relatives. Cleaning houses paid better than most jobs available to someone in her situation. She told herself it was temporary, that she would find a way back to music someday, but someday never came. Years passed, and the calluses on her fingers from cleaning replaced the ones she had earned from piano practice. She stopped listening to classical music because it hurt too much. She avoided pianos in the houses where she worked because the temptation to play was almost unbearable. "I haven't played seriously in 8 years," Maria told Margaret through her tears. "I was so afraid I had forgotten everything, but when I sat down at that piano tonight, it all came back." Margaret listened to every word, her own eyes filling with tears. As someone who had spent her life supporting classical music, she understood the magnitude of what had been lost. Not just Maria's career, but all the beauty she would have brought to the world through her art. Meanwhile, in the living room, Richard was facing uncomfortable questions from his other guests. They wanted to know about Maria's background, her training, how long she had been playing. With each question, Richard felt smaller and more ashamed. "You really don't know anything about her, do you?" David Torres asked, not unkindly but with clear judgment in his voice. Richard shook his head. He was beginning to understand how badly he had misjudged not just Maria, but himself. He had thought he was sophisticated, cultured, successful. But what kind of person employed someone for months without caring to learn anything about their life or dreams? When Margaret returned from the kitchen, her face was serious. She pulled Richard aside and spoke to him in a low, urgent voice. "That woman in your kitchen is one of the most gifted musicians I've ever heard," she said. "Do you understand what you have in your house? Do you realize what talent you just tried to humiliate?" Richard felt his stomach drop. "I had no idea. I didn't know she could play." "Of course you didn't know," Margaret replied sharply, "because you never asked. You saw a woman from another country doing manual labor and assumed that was all she was capable of. You made her invisible." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Margaret was right, and they both knew it. He had done exactly what she accused him of. He had looked at Maria and seen only what he expected to see, not who she really was. "She told me she has a daughter back in Guatemala who plays violin," Margaret continued. "A gifted student who dreams of studying music in America. Do you know what Maria is sacrificing every day to make those dreams possible?" Richard didn't answer because he couldn't. The comfortable world he had built for himself, where he was the successful hero of his own story, was crumbling around him. He had thought he was better than people like Maria, more accomplished, more worthy of respect. But the truth was the opposite. As his guests prepared to leave, Richard found himself alone with thoughts he didn't want to face. The woman he had tried to humiliate possessed more real culture and talent than he ever would. The piano he had bought to impress people had been brought to life by hands he had considered beneath his notice. For the first time in years, Richard Blackwood felt truly small. 3 days had passed since the dinner party, and Richard couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He wandered through his mansion like a ghost, seeing everything differently now. The expensive art on his walls seemed empty and cold. The designer furniture felt like props in a play he no longer wanted to perform. But it was the piano that haunted him most. Every time he walked past it, he remembered the magic that had poured from those keys under Maria's touch. He had owned that instrument for 2 years without ever hearing its true voice. Now he wondered what else in his life he had possessed without understanding. Maria had continued working as if nothing had changed, arriving each morning at the same time, completing her tasks with the same quiet efficiency. But Richard noticed things he had never seen before. The gentle way she handled his books when dusting as if she understood their value, the care she took arranging flowers, creating small works of art that he had previously ignored. On Thursday morning, Richard found her in the music room during her break. She wasn't cleaning anything, just sitting on the piano bench with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the keys with a longing that made his chest ache. "Maria," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, quickly standing as if she had been caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, I was just—" "Please, sit back down," Richard said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "I wanted to talk to you." Maria remained standing, uncertain. In her experience, conversations with employers usually meant criticism or more work assignments. But there was something different in Richard's manner today, a humility she had never seen before. "I owe you an apology," Richard began, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had apologized to anyone, let alone someone he employed. "What I did at the dinner party was wrong. I tried to embarrass you in front of my guests, and I'm ashamed of myself." Maria stayed quiet, not sure how to respond. Apologies from wealthy employers were not something she had experienced before. "I realized something after that night," Richard continued. "I've been living in my own house with someone remarkable, and I never bothered to see who you really were. I treated you like furniture, like you didn't matter as a person." "It's okay, Mr. Blackwood," Maria said automatically, the response she had learned to give to difficult situations. "No, it's not okay," Richard insisted. And please call me Richard. I think we've moved past formal titles, don't you? He gestured toward the piano bench, and after a moment's hesitation, Maria sat down. Richard pulled over a chair from the corner, positioning it so they could talk as equals rather than employer and employee. Tell me about your music, he said simply. So Maria told him. About growing up poor but surrounded by music. About her mother working 2 jobs to pay for piano lessons. About the scholarship that changed everything. The concerts that made her feel alive. The dreams of studying in Vienna or New York. She told him about the fear that drove her family from Guatemala. About watching her world crumble as violence consumed her country. About the heartbreak of leaving her piano behind, knowing she might never see it again. I used to practice 6 hours a day, Maria said, her fingers unconsciously moving as if she was playing invisible keys. Music was my language, my way of understanding the world. When I lost it, I felt like I lost myself. Richard listened without interrupting, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been taken from her. This wasn't just about a job or even a career. This was about an artist being separated from her art, a soul being disconnected from its purpose. Why didn't you ever tell me? Richard asked. Maria looked at him with surprise. You never asked. And even if you had, would it have mattered? I'm still just the maid who cleans your house. The words hit Richard like a slap. She was right, of course. Even if he had known about her background, would he have treated her any differently? He wanted to say yes, but he wasn't sure he could honestly make that claim. My daughter, Isabella, she's 17 now. Maria continued, her voice softening. She plays violin beautifully. She wants to study music in America at a real conservatory. Everything I do, every house I clean, every dollar I save, it's for her dream. The dream you gave up, Richard said quietly. The dream I passed on, Maria corrected. Sometimes that's what love means. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Richard spoke again. Would you play for me? Just for me, I mean. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because I'd like to hear it again. Maria looked at him carefully, searching for any trace of the cruel manipulation from the dinner party. But she saw only genuine request, maybe even need. She turned to the keyboard and began to play something different this time. Not the challenging Chopin piece, but a simple folk melody from her childhood in Guatemala. The music was gentle and sweet, filled with memories of her mother humming while she cooked, of children playing in dusty streets, of a world that existed now only in her heart. As she played, Richard felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about impressing anyone or proving anything. This was just beauty, pure and simple, shared between 2 people who were finally seeing each other clearly. When the song ended, Richard made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I have a proposal for you, he said. Not as your employer, but as someone who wants to make things right. Maria waited, curious but cautious. Use this piano whenever you want. Practice here, play here, make it yours. And I'd like to help you connect with people in the music community. Margaret Chen left her card for you, didn't she? Maria nodded, pulling the business card from her pocket. She had been afraid to call the number, unsure what someone like Margaret Chen could want with a house cleaner. She runs programs for immigrant musicians, Richard continued. She could help you find your way back to performing, maybe even help with Isabella's application to American conservatories. I don't understand, Maria said. Why would you do this? Richard was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right words. Because I've spent my whole life acquiring things I don't really appreciate. I bought this piano to impress people, but you brought it to life. Maybe it's time I learned to see the value in things that can't be bought. Over the following months, Richard's house began to fill with music. Maria practiced every day, her skills returning like flowers after rain. Richard, meanwhile, began taking piano lessons from her, discovering that learning something difficult and beautiful was far more satisfying than simply buying it. When Isabella finally arrived from Guatemala 6 months later, carrying her violin case and her mother's dreams, she found her mother at the piano and a man who had learned that true wealth comes from recognizing the extraordinary in people you might otherwise overlook. The music they made together filled the mansion with something it had never known before. The sound of lives being lived fully, of talents being honored, and of 2 people who had learned to see each other as they truly were.